Hi guys, welcome back to the second part of our series on Capablanca using various strategic devices to beat his opponents. As you can see from us not having changed clothes, it's still the same warm day in Hamburg, and once again I'm being joined by Mr. Rustam Kasimdzhanov. What will we learn in this lesson, Rustam?
This is a pretty simple but a pretty instructive example of Capablanca using opponents' weaknesses to win his games.
Okay.
And I chose this particular example because it is very clear-cut, one weakness and speedy, confident display of strategy. So in this case, his opponent was Bogolubov.
So Capablanca is black.
Capablanca is black. And Bogolubov might not be very well known to all of our viewers, but in fact he was a world championship title contender for, I think, 2 times against Alekhine.
I have no idea.
Against Alekhine?
He's the guy who got crushed by Vallejo.
Yes.
Or Alekhine.
Twice, I think.
Twice, yeah.
Twice, yeah.
Okay.
But actually he did put up a fight. I think in one of these matches he won 5 games against Alekhine, but I think he lost 10.
I wasn't aware of that. I mean, I've come across the name in chess books, but I never thought of him as a world-class player. Well, clearly he was for the times.
He was, yes. He was a world-class player. But in this case, he, playing white, didn't play very ambitiously in the opening. And as a result, he had one weakness in his position. And usually one weakness is not enough to lose the game. But it is enough to make your life pretty miserable for a while. So in this game we will see how Capablanca first puts pressure upon his opponent's weakness and then later wins the material. He started with Rook c7. It's a normal way to attack the weakness by doubling the rooks.
It's also nice for black that he doesn't have any weaknesses, at least none that meet the eye, right? I mean, his pawn structure is very compact.
That's a very good observation, yes. Black does not have any weaknesses, and this makes it very difficult for white to create any counterplay. For instance, imagining if black would play something like b5, then white would suddenly get counterplay because black got a weakness in his position. And white would continue with knight c5 and b4, and white would be more than fine.
Also trapping the queen in the process.
Wow.
No, I get the point.
And also black's king is extremely safe on g8 with his pawns in front of him. So in general, all this leaves white with very little counterplay and doomed to, at the moment at least, passive defense.
Yeah, so the culprit is really the pawn on b3, right? If the guy was on b2, not only could he take the queen, but also the pawn structure would be kind of safe, yeah, and the position would be very equal.
Well, which is even more important, yeah, than the queen being hanging on a3. But in general, yes, every pawn weakness is created because some other pawns were moving.
Fair point.
Pawns on the starting positions, they remain very flexible, create no weaknesses. Every time we start moving pawns, like in this particular case, white played at some point in this game b3, c3, and f3. These pawns, these movements create weaknesses. In this case, moving b3 created the weakness on c3. Moving f3, this is not yet very visible, but also weakened some squares and potentially also the white king. Because the squares are close to the king. So, but in general, so far these weaknesses are not yet very serious, and black concentrates on eyeing the pawn on c3 at first. So after rook c7, white also played rook c1. This is normal. Rook c8, rook c2, and now comes a very important point of the game. Black doubled his rooks, but white is more than equipped to protect his pawn on c3 in a short run.
So it's kind of a question. The rooks are in the right place. Which piece or pawn can we improve to improve our position? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very good point. The queen is also annoyingly placed on a3, controlling a lot of squares and being very mobile. It can go to a5, or it can go back depending on circumstances. But the piece which is not participating in the battle at the moment, in the battle for the square pawn on c3, is the knight on f6.
It's also a typical thing if the knight is, I'm counting 4 squares away from the opposing pawn. The pawn kind of controls it, yeah? Like here the pawn on f3 might have generated weaknesses, but it also covers the e4 and g4 squares for the knight. So the knight doesn't have that much to do on f6.
Oh, that's true, yeah. And we also should mention that black can only afford to relocate the knight from f6 because his king is so safe. He does not need a piece protecting his king. And Capablanca found, or in this case I'm pretty sure Capablanca failed, the right maneuver and played knight e8. Very often the squares d3 and d6 are the best squares for the knight on the chessboard, because many opening series like this, yeah. And in this particular case, both the knight on d3 and the knight coming to d6, they're both doing a great job. White knight controlling a lot of squares and trying to jump to c5 to e5 at a given moment, and black knight coming to d6 also controls, or in fact threatens knight b5 and controls important squares e4 and f5 for the future. And basically white felt that pawn on c3 needs further reinforcement, played rook fc1. It should be noted that whilst knight e8 may seem a bit far from the king side at the moment, from some possible action, the attempt at some counterplay with, let's say, f4 would backfire very badly, because the knight coming to d6 controls f5 and returns to the square e4 with decisive effect.
Yeah, that would be generating even more serious weaknesses.
So white correctly played rook fc1, and black played knight d6, and black more or less achieved what he wanted to achieve. He activated his knight. He's threatening knight b5, putting additional pressure on the pawn on c3. And now it's interesting to observe that if white were to play something like, for instance, king h1 just waiting, after knight b5, he wouldn't be able to go c4 because d4 would be hanging. Very often pawns which are weak are not only weak in themselves, but also make squares near them or pawns near them also vulnerable. This is very often the case. That's why in a position like this it is very difficult to protect your weaknesses in a long run, because we'll see many actions will also create new weaknesses. But so far Bogolyubov is doing a good job. Played knight e5, activating the knight and creating the possibility of c4, for instance, after knight b5 and c4. Now queen is protecting the pawn on d4, and white gets rid of his weakness, and the game becomes, I think, pretty level after that. So black has to be a bit more subtle than this. So he brings another piece to attack the pawn on c3, and we also see that not only white is suffering from the weakness of the pawn on c3, this pawn is also pinned in many directions. The queen is pinning the pawn because of the queen on d2, and the rooks also have this pinning effect on the pawn. So white is likely to be saddled with this weakness for a while. And now knight b5 is a serious threat, as we see.
I've been so quiet because I've been wondering about this move knight e5. It looks nice and active. I'm sorry, we can go back for one move for a second. But now I'm worried that we won't be able to defend our weakness on c3 anymore. And I was wondering if it was possible to play very passively, to play maybe knight f2 and knight to d1, which doesn't look very nice, but at least our weakness would be covered forever, yeah?
Yes, you can do this in two ways. You can either bring the knight to e2.
Oh, also, yeah, for example.
Or to d1.
Maybe better.
But I think in either case, the passivity of this knight and the passivity of all the other pieces will make White's defense very, very difficult in the long run. For instance, if we make some moves like knight f4, say queen a5, as in the game, knight e2, b5, and then black continues, say, with queen b6, a5, b4.
Oh, some classic minority kind of attack.
Some minority attack, and also the pin on the c file means that it's going to be very difficult for White to do anything about it.
No, there could be another effect of weaknesses, that even if they can be protected, they force pieces to go into passive squares, which then hurts us in some other ways.
Yeah, you know what I notice very often? Sometimes it's useful to lose the weakness. If you lose the weakness, then kind of your pieces
life gets easier. The problem is normally you're down upon that.
Well, that's true, yeah. In this particular case, White's best try is to avoid complete passivity, but White also has to be accurate doing this.
Okay, so back to the game. Sorry.
Knight e5, queen a5. Now Black actually threatens
knight b5.
Knight b5. Because knight on e5 is active and everything, but in fact it is not able to protect the pawn on c3.
No, that's what I meant. Yeah.
And now here White, for instance, if White makes a waiting move like king h1, knight b5, c4, queen d2, rook d2, and f6.
Tricks.
Using the aforementioned pin, White is already losing material. And here Bogolyubov panicked, which is also an important thing to consider. When facing a long and difficult defense, it's very difficult to keep one's cool and to continue making good defensive moves. As defending side, we should definitely aim to remain calm. And as an attacking side, it is useful to know that our opponents will not be able to make the best defensive moves all the time, because it is so very difficult. And in this case, the best defensive move was queen e3, moving out from the pin. And now, after knight b5, I would actually be able to go c4. So after queen e3, Black would be forced to look for new ways to exploit White's weakness. His attempt could include maybe going b5 now, because the knight moved away from the square c5, and then maybe continuing with a classical minority attack. But White's defenses are still not broken, and he could have every chance of defending this position successfully.
By the way, when we're talking about minority attack, which is a typical thing for this pawn structure, it's not a Tom Cruise movie, but it's the two pawns attacking the three pawns. So it's the A and B pawn advancing to force a weakness among the B2, C3, A2 pawns, right?
Yes, and it is only possible because in general Black's position is more active, because otherwise usually the side having more pawns would attack. But in this particular case, White's pawns are weak. They need defense, incapable of attacking, and thus the side with less pawns on the queen side is actually able to generate initiative there. So, as I said, Bogolyubov did not keep his calm here. He lost his nerves and played a4. It might have looked to him at the time that he's preventing knight b5 once and for all, but as we mentioned before, every pawn move creates a weakness, or can create a weakness. And in this case, now not only White's pawn on c3 is weak as before, but also the pawn on b3 did not got weaker, and in fact constitutes a classical second weakness. When the defending side can for a long time be defending the one weakness, but when it has to defend two, it usually proves impossible. And in this case, the pretty simple attack of the second weakness already left white facing a very difficult choice. He has to...
I have to say, even though I hear everything you're saying about the pawns on b3 and c3 being weak, I kind of really like this pawn structure with the pawns on a4, b3, c3, and d4, because it looks like a bathtub.
Does it? I have quite some imagination.
You've never heard that? The structure is called the bathtub.
I've never heard of this, yeah.
No.
And I'm from classical Soviet chess school, yeah.
No, maybe you don't call it that. In German, the Badewanne, it's a very common thing.
Bathtub,
anyway,
yeah.
It's reasonably off topic, and these pawns are very weak. But they do look like a bathtub, let's face it.
Yeah, I think Soviet chess school would say a rotten pawn structure for something like
it's
this.
Boring.
Maybe, yeah. As a matter of fact, yeah, I should think about this more. But as I said, it's difficult to protect the pawn on b3 because having a pawn on c3 as a second weakness or as a first weakness in our case makes it awkward. I mean, any kind of defensive move like rook b2, and now we see that pawn on c3 is much more vulnerable than before, and because of all the pins, the pin
Some
is
tricks,
here and here. I mean, black can just go f6.
f6, yeah, and I see some tricks on the horizon. Knight d3, rook takes c3 or something.
This is a nice trick, and if it were not for this trick, then for instance knight g4, e5, or knight g4, knight f5, threatening knight d4, and e5 to come later, basically white is overstretched.
Yeah.
He has played a4, he has created weaknesses, and now he's not able to protect them anymore. And the move b4...
That's the beauty of these classical games, and I mean no disrespect at all to any of the players, but very often you can win very cleanly with just piece maneuvering and attacking the weaknesses and having a superior structure. Yeah? So they make for very good examples. Well,
that's why they are very good instructive material. Yeah, you can learn much better from Capablanca's games than from, say, Kasparov's games, because in Kasparov's case the resistance of his opponents was so much.
Well, it depends what you're trying to learn, yeah? If you want to learn the Najdorf, you might... No, I'm kidding. I hear you.
But if you want to learn some basic strategic elements, here you see them basically dissected into small pieces, like with a careful surgeon's hand, yeah? And you can show the pin, you can show the weakness, and all these concepts will be clearly visible. Like in this case, b4 would, of course, protect the weakness, but also create new pretty ugly weaknesses. And we see that, for instance, after a5, if white would go, say, ba5, queen a5, again, there is another weakness which would be impossible to protect. And after b5, knight c4, I mean, there will be also other continuations, knight c4, rook c4, again, there are two weaknesses. And after rook a2, e5, white begins to collapse slowly but steadily.
Quite quickly, actually.
Probably quite quickly, yes. I was wondering if you can actually collapse steadily, but there you go.
Probably you can.
So instead of all this, Bogolyubov realized that, okay, he's probably not going to save this game. He cannot save his weaknesses. He made a desperate attempt to activate some of the pieces, but in fact this only quickened the disaster. He played knight d3. This kind of despair, psychological despair, is also typical for the side defending a very bad position for a long time. So black took, queen b6, and white was able to make a couple of active moves, but his position did not improve.
Yeah, this looks hopeless. Once the bathtub is broken, there's no fixing it.
It starts leaking, yeah. That's true, yeah. And in this case, you see that white lost the pawn, but in fact his positional problems, his weaknesses, they remained. And after some more desperate moves, White gave some more material to activate the knight.
Knight b5, yeah.
Knight
Nice
b5.
square.
And now the last trick, which can only work against the opponent who is too relaxed and too confident and might have been falling asleep by now. White played rook e2, threatening rook takes e6.
Oh, nice.
And I mean, after a move like a4, for instance, rook takes e6 with an idea f takes e6, queen takes e6, and then queen c8, it would suddenly get very, very unclear.
Rook e2 might be a little too obvious, right? It's also telegraphing his intentions.
Yeah, that was unfortunate for Bogolyubov, and Capablanca, who was always on a lookout for tactical ways to finish his opponent, spotted
That's one of his famous petite combinaisons, right?
Yeah.
Pardon my French, but I think that's another thing he's famous for, right? These small combinations to finish off games.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, it's not only that he was famous for this, it is also a slightly underestimated topic in general, that these great strategic players, they were always wonderful tacticians, because very often you need to be able to calculate some tactical blow to finish your opponent off.
Well, in general, all these words like strategy and tactics, there are distinctions that we make to explain what they're doing. Well, what he's really looking for is the best move. And here he improved his position, and then he will spot the thing. But yeah, I agree that very often first you improve your position, and then you exploit it tactically.
And in this case, this tactical blow is actually quite elegant.
It's quite nice, yeah?
He played knight takes d4, c takes d4, and now White finally looks in control of things. His piece up and everything, but after rook takes c5.
So finally, what you pointed out in the beginning, the pawn on f3 is White's demise here, because he can't take on c5. Well, he can, it doesn't really matter what he does. And then queen takes c5 would be check because of the guy on f3.
And Black wins.
Black wins back his material with quite some interest.
So White resigned after rook takes c5. What I also observed in this game is that Capablanca managed to convert his advantage without giving any counterplay at all.
By the way, I would never resign here. I would try rook takes e6, hoping for rook takes c1.
Well, I mean,
rook e8 checkmate.
I think you should try. Capablanca would have been forced to find a couple of more good moves.
Yeah, because you have to make some moves, yeah?
Queen takes e6 and queen f7. And now you would have to resign.
Yeah, I'm afraid here I'm in trouble.
And I selected this game because it is very clean, very instructive, and one of, I think, best examples of weakness exploiting I could find in Capablanca's practice.
All right, thanks a lot for staying with us, and I hope you're enjoying watching the great Cuban. Is that his nickname? I'm not sure. I hope you're enjoying the lessons, and see you next time. Bye.
Bye.